Today's podcast will be a little different. Rather than give you my opinions, I'll be reading to you a recollection of the life of a girl named Annie. Before we get into that, you're listening to That Other Life. I'm your host, Richard Haddad. What I'm about to read are excerpts from homemakerscorner.com. Here's how it reads. Annie was born on Christmas Eve of 1866 in New Jersey. Eldon and Jean Johnson, the father and mother, welcomed that Christmas present as the greatest earthly gift. The father was of English descent and the mother was Scottish. The only remembrance of her mother dates back to the time just before her mother's death in 1869, at the age of 23, following the birth of a baby sister for Annie. The father took the children to board with the widow of an old army comrade who had been killed in the Civil War. It was not a happy arrangement. The woman had 2 children of her own and her means were very limited. During the 2 years the Johnson girls added to the cares of that family, they were evidently unwelcome and unwanted. But it was at this time when the outlook seemed so dark for their young lives that a neighbor interposed in a kindly way. She loomed in the memory as Aunt Susie, although she could claim no blood relation to this friend. Aunt Susie was a schoolteacher and boarded near the school in the home of a Mr. and Mrs. Flint. She became so strongly attached to the Johnson girls that she was continually speaking of them to the Flints, and at last so aroused their sympathy on behalf of the motherless children that a little over 2 years after their mother's death, they were adopted by the Flints, whose name thereafter they bore. While the name might sound so hard and stony, their hearts were very tender. 2 things made Mr. Johnson willing to part with his 2 daughters. First, he was suffering at that time with an incurable disease, from which he shortly afterwards died. Second, the Flints offered a home after his own desire. They were Christians, and Mr. Johnson was very anxious that his children should be brought up in a Christian faith. When Annie was 8 years old, the family moved houses. When they reached their new home in town, revival meetings were in progress, and Annie attended. It was during one of those meetings that the Spirit of God worked in her young heart and brought her to saving faith in Christ. She always believed that at that time she was truly converted. And while she did not attend meetings until 10 years later, she never doubted that the eternal work had already begun. Whether by nature or through her early Christian experience, Annie was generally disposed to be cheerful and optimistic. She looked on the bright side of life and was quite fond of jokes and able to get much enjoyment out of her life. Aunt Susie had often told her that when she was just learning to walk, she marched across the room with head up regardless of any obstacles in the way. And a forward-looking, lifted-up head was a characteristic attitude. It was typical of the courage which she was to manifest in later life when she was hemmed in by so many trials. She certainly learned to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. She was generous and ever ready to share what she had with others. She was even more willing to grant favors than to accept them. Nevertheless, Annie was still human. She had her weaknesses also. She records her greatest fault as a lack of patience with herself as well as others. She did not like to wait for a thing. She wanted to see results at once. One Bible verse that she felt was written especially for her was Hebrews chapter 6 verse 12. Be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Finishing high school, she had a position offered to her. It was a great temptation to begin earning money. But as her foster mother was failing in health, and already having had one slight stroke, she felt that she was really needed at home. Instead, she started teaching the primary class in the same school that she had attended as a little girl. Early in her 2nd year of teaching, arthritis began to show itself. She tried several doctors in turn, but it steadily grew worse until it became difficult for her to walk at all, and she had a hard time finishing out her 3rd year of teaching. After that, she was obliged to give up her work, and there followed 3 years of increasing helplessness. The death of both her adopted parents within a few months of each other left the two girls alone again. There was little money in the bank, and the twice orphaned children had come to a real Red Sea place in their lives. It was just then that the faithful Aunt Susie again came to the rescue. She had been in the sanitarium at Clifton Springs, New York, and was convinced that Annie could find help and healing there. Picture, if you can, the hopelessness of Annie's position when she finally received the verdict of the doctors of the Clifton Springs Sanitarium that from there on she would be a helpless invalid. Her own parents had been taken from her in childhood, and her foster parents both passed away. Her one sister was very frail and struggling to meet her own situation bravely. Annie was in a condition where she was compelled to be dependent upon the care of others who could not afford to minister to her. With a pen pushed through bent fingers and held by swollen joints, she began to write without any thought that it might be an avenue of ministry, or that it would bring her returns that might help in her support. Her poems provided a solace for her in the long hours of suffering. Then she began making hard-lettered cards and gift books and decorated some of her own poems. 2 card publishers printed these greetings, and this helped to get her foot on the first rung of the ladder of support. It gave her the larger vision of possibly securing openings through some of the magazines, by which her poems could be a wider blessing and at the same time bring some little return that would minister to her own pressing need. But there came times of real testing and trials. Sales sometimes fell off, and extra needs pressed in. Sometimes for considerable periods she had to have a trained nurse. There were doctor's bills running up, and then too she was under pressure of many other trials. But again, it was in these very conditions that some of the hard experiences wrought by them brought her where she could be a blessing and help to others. One of her sweetest sonnets, which she says was born of experience of another, would never have found expression if it had not been for her own trials. The special incident that drew it forth was the visit of a little, tired, discouraged deaconess to Clifton Springs. She used to call and tell her troubles to Annie, and when she left and went back to the West, she wrote saying how blue she felt and how downhearted, and she didn't see why God allowed such hard things to come into her life. Annie put her answer in a poem. She titled it, "What God Has Promised." God has not promised skies always blue, flower-strewn pathways all our lives through. God has not promised sun without rain, joy without sorrow, peace without pain. But God has promised strength for the day, rest for the labor, light for the way, grace for the trials, help from above, unfailing kindness and undying love. God has not promised we shall not know toil and temptation, trouble and woe. He has not told us we shall not bear many a burden, many a care. God has not promised smooth roads and wide, swift easy travel needing no guide, never a mountain rocky and steep, never a river turbid and deep. In another sphere, her friends criticized and challenged her faith. As her story became known far and wide, it was natural that she should receive many visitors. Many of these were sincerely interested in her welfare, among them some who strongly believed that healing of the body was for every child of God in this life. Their claim was that healing was in the atonement and purchase for us by Christ, and that everyone who was walking obediently could claim deliverance from physical infirmities and bodily sicknesses. She listened to what they had to say. More than that, she went earnestly and prayerfully to search the scriptures as to God's will. It was only after a most painstaking study and prayer, and reading of the best writers on this subject, that she reached the conclusion, while God can and does heal in this way in some cases, in others he does not. He has seen fit to leave some of the most triumphant saints deeply afflicted. She saw too many of those who pressed their theory were themselves afflicted with infirmity, and while telling others that they ought to claim healing, bore in their own lives the failure of the theory. Annie became thoroughly convinced that God intended to glorify himself through her in her weak earthen vessel. And like Paul, she had 3 times and more prayed that this might be taken from her. There came to her with real assurance the promise which said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. The last years of her life brought her no ease from her affliction, no lessening of pain and suffering. In Annie's own notes and journal, her affliction received little notice. She would have it so. Although crippled, she did not consider herself helpless, and that she could do nothing but bemoan her lot. She believed that God had laid her aside for a purpose, even though that purpose was obscure to her at times. But she also believed that He had work for her to do, and she put her very best into the writing of her poems, rendering this ministry to Him. Out of the crucible of suffering, she was able to administer comfort to others, because she herself had been comforted of God. No one but God and she knew what suffering she endured as the disease became worse with the passing of the years, and new complications developed. But through it all, her faith in the goodness and mercy of God never wavered. For more than 40 years, there was scarcely a day when she did not suffer pain. On September 8th of 1932, she felt very tired and wondered if she could live the day out. When the doctor was called, he stated that it was just weakness. But all that day, she did not improve, and the doctor was called again in the evening. He saw at once that she was in great distress and her heart was behaving badly. He asked if there was anything she wished to say or have a friend do, as she might not rally. Her last words were, "I have nothing to say. It's all right." A few minutes later, she had gone to be with Christ. Sorrow, pain, suffering, and death were ended forever, for the former had passed away. In considering the life of Annie Johnson Flint, one is perplexed with questions as old as humanity itself, such as the mystery of pain and suffering. That the wicked should suffer as the reward for their wrongdoing seems just and right, but that the righteous should pass through the furnace, sometimes heated 7 times, is a great stumbling block to many people. That is because we only see half the circle of life. One thing we are sure of, and that is that the divine potter makes no mistakes as he molds the clay in his hands. When it comes forth from his hand, he has fashioned it indeed, a goodly vessel prepared and fit for the master's use. If you want to read more about Annie Johnson Flint's story, you can read her biography written by Roland Bingham called The Making of the Beautiful. The Binghams were one of the 2 publication groups who published Annie Flint's poems. Ravi Zacharias speaks a little about this and mentions that on top of the extreme arthritis that crippled Annie, she also suffered with cancer. She was incontinent and lived on diapers. Blindness started to overtake her. Roland Bingham says that before Annie died, from head to toe she had boils and marks on her body from lying in bed. She needed 8 pillows to cushion her body. But amid all the pain, she wrote some very beautiful hymns. I already read one out to you. Allow me to read one more. This one is called He Giveth More Grace, and it goes like this. He giveth more grace as our burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength as our labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiply trials he multiplies peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed, oh, the day is half done. When we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limits, His grace has no measure, His power no boundary known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. Obviously, I never knew or met Annie Flint, but I had the privilege of knowing and meeting Alfred Haddad. Alfred suffered with cancer for over 3 years. He spent a full year without the ability to speak at all. There wasn't a single day in those 3 years where he wasn't in pain. a pain which only grew stronger and more unbearable. Although his mouth was silent, his heart never was. Throughout his life, Alf wrote many poems and songs. His cancer didn't stop him. He picked up a stylus and grabbed his tablet and continued to write. One of the songs he wrote in Arabic says in the chorus, "Jesus, I will praise your name, despite all that I'm going through. Even if I remain in pain, I'll lift your name and praise you still. You're the greatest and most faithful friend. You comfort me in time of need. I've known your love that knows no end. I lift your name and praise you still." How God works and why he works the way he does, we don't know. What we do know is that he doesn't let us go through it alone. Sometimes he parts the Red Sea as he did with Moses. Sometimes he silences the storms as he did with the disciples. Sometimes, though, he lets us be thrown in the fire like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And moments later we realize that he is walking in there with us. To God be all the glory. Thank you for listening. I'm Richard Haddad. These haven't been so much my opinions, but lessons from others who truly lived that other life.